The frenzy of free agency has come and gone, with teams having spent a collective $1 billion to acquire new talent on the open market. Some teams spent their money very, very wisely. Others spent it quite poorly. But there were 10 contracts given out that stood out to me as incredible value, 5 on the positive side and 5 on the negative. So let's look at the 5 best value signings of free agency so far and the 5 worst value signings. And we'll start on the negative side with what I believe is the 5th worst value signing of free agency so far, that being the Columbus Blue Jackets adding center Shawn Monahan for a 5-year, $27.5 million contract that averages out to a cap hit of $5.5 million per year. Now, while I do think some people are being a little hyperbolic as to how bad this contract is, it's still really bad. Now, on the positive side, this contract does lock up Shawn Monahan for most of the remainder of his prime, starting at age 30, going till age 35. The other positive of this contract is that Monahan has been pretty durable over the course of his career. Excepting the 2022-23 season, he's played at least 50 games in every year of his NHL career. And he's usually been good for about 20 goals and 50 to 60 points a year, excepting those last couple of years in Calgary. The problem with this contract is quite simple. It's the money. His cap hit is the same next year as Zach Hyman's was this year, and obviously Zach Hyman's contract looks like incredible value right now, but another way of looking at it is that Shawn Monahan just got signed to the same cap hit as Jake DeBrusk, a player who is 3 years younger, but in fairness is a 40 to 50 point guy, whereas Monahan's regularly been, like I said, a 50-60 point guy. The fact is his contract will probably be decent value for the first few years, but in years 4 and 5 it could start to look pretty ugly for Monahan. Now, the 5th best contract that was signed this offseason, in my opinion, was by the defending Western Conference champions, the Edmonton Oilers, who signed Jeff Skinner to a 1-year deal for $3 million after being bought out by Buffalo. To me, this is just incredible value. Yes, Skinner is going to be 32 this year, but it's only a 1-year contract. Like Monahan, there are no major injury concerns. In fact, he's played at least half of the games in a season for every year of his career. He's 2 years removed from a 30-goal, 80-point season, and last year, which was a down year, he still put up 24 goals and 46 points. This contract is the epitome of low risk, low reward to me, because even if Skinner has another down year like he did last year, for $3 million to get 40-50 points out of a guy, I think it's probably worth it. And if he booms kind of the way that Hyman did when he came over to Edmonton and potentially becomes a 70, 80, even 90 point, dare I say, player in Edmonton, playing alongside Draisaitl and McDavid, this is going to be an incredible value contract. So I like this deal from Edmonton. Number 4, in terms of the worst value contracts that were signed, belongs to the Minnesota Wild, who signed forward Yakov Trenin to a 4-year contract worth $14 million, rounding out to a $3.5 million cap hit per year. Trenin right now is currently projected to be a 3rd or 4th line winger for the Wild. He's never put up more than 25 points in a season, and he has a career Corsi % of 45.8, even though he's been on some very good teams in Nashville and Colorado. It's definitely more of a defensive warrior and penalty killer, which is fine if you want to bring in a guy who's in his prime to do that, but I don't think you need to be paying that guy $3.5 million a year for 4 years, considering that's the exact same contract that the New York Islanders gave to Anthony Duclair, a career for 50-point player who's arguably just as good defensively as Trenin is. Back to the positives, we go to the Detroit Red Wings, who signed one of my favorite players in the NHL, one of the most underrated defensemen, Erik Gustafsson, to a 2-year deal worth $4 million total. Gustafsson is one of the most quietly efficient defensemen in the NHL, a career Corsi for percentage of 55.6. He actually had a 60-point season in his 2nd year in Chicago, and the last couple of years he's been a consistent 30-40 point guy. The only knock on Gustafsson is that there are some durability concerns, but to get a guy who can play bottom pairing minutes and potentially quarterback your power play for $2 million, and who might be able to replace or at least offset some of Shane Gostisbehere's production from last year, is a great bargain. Now, the 3rd worst contract that was signed this last offseason should come as no surprise to anybody. It's the Los Angeles Kings, who signed defenseman Joel Edmondson to a 4-year deal with a cap hit of almost $4 million, $3.85 million a year to be exact. As many people online have pointed out, this signing has Marc Bergevin's fingerprints all over it, because at this point Joel Edmondson is nothing more than a stay-at-home defenseman who has had cratering puck possession stats playing bottom pairing minutes. In fact, his last 3 seasons in the NHL, he did not have a Corsi for above 45% in any of those years. And signing Edmondson to a contract with a higher average cap hit than Sean Walker got in Carolina, who's 2 years younger and just plain and simply better defensively, is just egregious malpractice by the Kings. Now, in my opinion, the 3rd best value signing by any team in free agency so far was the Vegas Golden Knights signing Victor Olofsson to a 1-year, $1.07 million deal. Olofsson has had 4 straight seasons of at least 30 points, with 3 of those seasons having 20 goals and 40 points. Unlike in Buffalo, he'll be playing with much higher quality offensive players, so you can expect that his offensive numbers will go up, meaning we could potentially be looking at a 25-goal, 60-point guy who's making only $1 million. Hell, even if he only produces 30 points this year, which would be on the low end for him in his career, the value is just so good, it doesn't even matter. Now, the second worst contract that was signed this free agency period was by my Washington Capitals, who signed Brandon Duhaime to a 2-year deal worth $3.7 million, a $1.85 million average annual salary. I am of the opinion that you never overpay role players and non-elite goalies, and Duhaime is the epitome of a role player. He's going to project to be a 4th liner in Washington. He's been a bottom 6 guy in Minnesota and Colorado, and despite playing on those very good teams, he has a career Corsi for percentage of 43. He's never eclipsed 20 points in his career, and basically the only thing that he is good at is killing penalties. And I'm sorry, you do not need to pay a guy almost $2 million a year to get a good penalty killer. You let Nick Aube-Kubel walk for $1.5 million on a 1-year deal to Buffalo, that would have been a way better deal. And in fact, you signed another player to a great value deal in Taylor Raddysh, who got a 1-year deal for $1 million. Raddysh is as good, if not better, than Brandon Duhaime, yet somehow Duhaime warrants making almost twice as much and getting twice the term as him. And when you're a team that is up against the cap like the Caps are, you just cannot afford to waste money on guys who can be replaced by guys off the scrap heap. Now, the second best value contract signed this offseason will surprise a lot of people. It's the Tampa Bay Lightning, who signed Cam Atkinson to a 1-year deal for less than $1 million, $900K on the deal. I know Atkinson is a bit older, he's going to be 35 during this contract, but the guy is still good for at least 10 goals and 25 to 30 points. And again, going off of value, getting that offensive production for under $1 million is a great bargain deal, on top of the fact that Atkinson can play both on the power play and the PK. He can slot anywhere within the bottom 6 and potentially the middle 6 in a pinch. He adds leadership, and in his declining age, he's generally still been a positive possession player, putting up a 52.6 Corsi for last year. And even in his bad years, we're like 48-49% Corsi for, so he's not a possession black hole. He can flex around in your lineup admirably and do a good job doing it for a very minimal cost. And then we reach, in my opinion, the worst contract that was handed out this offseason, and it's going to surprise a lot of people. It belongs to the Edmonton Oilers, who re-signed Matias Yanmar to a 3-year deal worth $4.3 million, a 1.45 average annual value. Like I said with Duhaime, you don't overpay role players, which is what Edmonton did off of a great performance in the playoffs, but this contract is not borne out by any of Yanmar's production over the last few years. Now, he is a better offensive producer than Duhaime. He put up 2 25-point seasons a couple of years ago, but his Corsi for has been on a steady decline over the past few years to the levels of Brandon Duhaime, and he's probably about as good of a penalty killer as Duhaime. So the question you might be having is, why is Yanmar ranked lower when he's essentially the same player but making about $400K a year less? Well, the problems are he's locked up to a 3-year term as opposed to Duhaime's 2, and Yanmar is going to be 32 entering the start of this contract, whereas Duhaime is going to be 28. Those physical role players can hit a steep decline, and the fact that Yanmar is the same player that Duhaime is now doesn't mean that he will be the same level of player throughout the course of this contract. Just like for the Caps, Edmonton is tight to the cap. I don't think that they really can afford to be paying a declining 4th line plugger to kill penalties for them. Then we get to, in my opinion, the best value contract signed by any team this offseason, and it belongs to the defending champions Florida Panthers, who make the incredibly shrewd move to pick up Nate Schmidt from the Winnipeg Jets for a 1-year, $800,000 contract. This is basically the Eric Gustafsson contract, but on steroids. Nate Schmidt is an incredibly effective defenseman who can log bottom pairing minutes and play on the power play. He had an average Corsi for of 52.5% in Winnipeg, and only had 2 years in his entire career with a Corsi for below 50%. And even though he'll be 33 during this contract, it's for 1 year, and the value of the cap hit is so low that this contract is almost certain to get 2-3x the value of signing a guy like a TJ Brody, who is a better player, to be clear, but is making almost $4 million a year. Florida is going to get about half that production out of Nate Schmidt for barely a quarter of the cost, which is why this is the best value signing of any team in free agency thus far.